The evening air was heavy with the unmistakable weight of London's fog. The warmth of the fire cast a glow over the sitting room, a comforting contrast to the cold gloom outside. The quiet was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional clatter of a distant carriage. "It seems the city has surrendered to the fog tonight," came the comment, paired with a faint smile. "Surely even you, Holmes, cannot find mystery in such stillness." Stillness, Watson, is often deceptive. Beneath its calm lies a world waiting to reveal itself to the observant. There was a rhythm to the quiet moments like this. But as always, the stillness did not last long. The sharp rap of knuckles at the door broke the calm, echoing through the room. A pause, and then another knock, more insistent this time. "It appears we have company," Holmes noted, his gaze sharpening with anticipation. The door was opened to reveal a man, pale and trembling, his hands clutching a small, wrapped package. "Forgive the intrusion. I had no other choice." "Do come in," was the prompt response. The visitor was ushered to a chair. "Now, what troubles you at this late hour?" From within the bundle he carried, the man revealed a small vial filled with an iridescent green liquid. It seemed almost alive, casting faint reflections in the lamplight. "This belonged to my late uncle. He called it the Emerald Elixir," he began, his voice faltering. "He claimed it held great power, though he never said what that power was." The vial was held up to the light, Holmes's keen eyes studying every detail. "And yet, you bring it here. Why?" "Because I fear it is more than a curiosity. There is danger tied to this vial, and I do not know where else to turn." The man's story unfolded, each detail more unsettling than the last. His uncle, a chemist of some repute, had died 3 weeks prior under suspicious circumstances. Officially, it was ruled an accident, a fire caused by an experiment gone wrong. "That explanation does not sit well with you," Holmes observed. "No, it does not. He was meticulous in his work. An accident seems improbable. And there are whispers of alchemical studies, of experiments that defy reason. And yet these whispers brought no suspicion from the authorities," Holmes remarked, leaning back in thought. "None. But since his death, I have been followed and watched. And then there are the letters." A bundle of worn papers was produced, their edges frayed from handling. The letters bore no signature, only a ciphered text accompanied by ominous warnings. "They demand the elixir be returned. I cannot decipher them, but the meaning is clear. If I do not comply, I will face dire consequences." The letters were handed over, and Holmes studied them with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of their cryptic script. "This cipher," he mused, "uses symbols from 17th century alchemical texts. Whoever wrote these has knowledge and purpose. They are not empty threats," the man added. "Twice I have been followed. Once, I saw a figure standing in the street, watching my house." Holmes's focus sharpened. "And yet you have evaded them, bringing this to me." "That was a wise decision." A moment of silence passed as Holmes set the letters aside. "This is no ordinary case, Watson. A death, a cipher, an elixir that seems to defy nature. Each thread pulls us deeper into a web of ambition and fear." "You seem almost eager, Holmes." "Eager? No. Challenged. This is a matter that speaks to human nature itself. The lengths one will go for power, the dangers of unchecked curiosity." The weight of the mystery settled in the room, yet it was clear Holmes's mind was already racing ahead. Holmes rose with sudden energy, reaching for his coat. "Prepare yourself. We begin tonight. The laboratory of the late Dr. Philip Cartwright will provide answers, or at least, more questions." There was no need for further discussion. The quiet evening had transformed into the start of a new pursuit. The air carried a sense of both urgency and exhilaration. And with that, Holmes's familiar words rang clear. "The game is afoot." The estate loomed before us, its silhouette etched against the gloom of a foggy evening. The air was damp, the faint scent of earth mingling with the sharper tang of decay. We approached the door, its worn surface bearing marks of neglect, and stepped into the dim interior. The house had an air of abandonment, yet it was not devoid of life. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering light of a gas lamp. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, every object a story untold. "This house, Watson, is a witness," Holmes remarked, his sharp eyes scanning the dim hallway. "One only needs to listen." The weight of his words settled over me as we moved further inside, each step stirring the dust of years past. It was a place both intriguing and unnerving, its silence a prelude to the discoveries ahead. We entered the laboratory, the heart of the estate. It was a chaotic space, yet one where every item had its purpose. Beakers and flasks lined the shelves, their contents long evaporated or crystallized into mysterious residues. Strange symbols adorned the walls, a mix of alchemical runes and mathematical notations. Holmes's gaze swept over the room with the precision of a hawk. A cluttered mind often mirrors a cluttered space, yet in this chaos lies a method. He picked up a notebook, its pages filled with illegible scrawls and sketches of what appeared to be intricate machinery. Nearby, a cracked retort stood next to a pile of ash, evidence of experiments that had perhaps gone awry. This man, Holmes continued, was not simply a chemist. His work was an intersection of science and philosophy. Note the repetition of this symbol. He pointed to an intricate sigil etched into a piece of copper. It speaks to the union of elements, a concept central to alchemical pursuits. I could not help but shudder as I observed the strange instruments and symbols. It felt as though we had entered the mind of a man consumed by an obsession far beyond our understanding. As Holmes continued his examination, his attention was drawn to a desk. Its surface bore the stains of ink and acid, but it was the unusual wear on the edge of a drawer that caught his eye. With a deft movement, he pressed against the side of the drawer, revealing a concealed compartment. Inside were several coded journals and a partially burned letter. The letter's edges were blackened, yet its central message remained intact. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he read aloud. "The elixir is the key, but the key is not the elixir." A curious phrase, would you not agree, Watson? The journals, filled with diagrams and ciphers, hinted at experiments both ambitious and perilous. One page caught his attention, a detailed sketch of the emerald vial. "It appears we have only scratched the surface," he muttered. "This drawer alone is worth more than the entire estate." Miss Agatha Tilley, the late Dr. Cartwright's housekeeper, was summoned to explain the state of the house and its curious contents. She was a wiry woman with darting eyes that betrayed a mix of anxiety and evasion. "I tried to keep things in order," she began, her hands wringing a handkerchief. "But after the doctor's death, I couldn't bear to enter this room." Holmes studied her closely. "Yet you remained in the house, Miss Tilley. Why is that?" I had nowhere else to go," she stammered. "And someone had to keep an eye on his work, to ensure it wasn't tampered with." "Curious," Holmes replied, his tone sharp but calm. "Considering the state of this laboratory, one might assume you tampered with it yourself." Her face flushed. "I swear, I only wanted to protect his legacy. Or perhaps conceal something." Holmes's piercing gaze seemed to strip away her defenses, though she offered no further explanation. Holmes suggested we visit Professor Thaddeus Lyle, a known associate and rival of the late Dr. Cartwright. Lyle was a man of grand gestures and even grander opinions, his study cluttered with books and apparatuses similar to those in the laboratory. "I warned Philip," Lyle declared, his voice tinged with bitterness. "He was delving into matters best left untouched." "And what matters might those be?" Holmes inquired, his tone neutral yet probing. "Immortality," Lyle replied with a derisive laugh. "A fool's errand." He believed the elixir could unlock the secrets of eternal life. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And you did not share his enthusiasm?" "Hardly. I pursued alchemy for knowledge, not fantasies." Yet he refused to listen, and now he has paid the price. Lyle's alibi for the night of the fire was airtight, yet his disdain for Cartwright and his fascination with the elixir left a lingering suspicion. Upon returning to London, Holmes and I met with Inspector Lestrade to discuss the official investigation. True to form, Lestrade was dismissive. "It was an accident," he said. "A fire caused by one of his experiments. There's no mystery here, Holmes." "And yet," Holmes countered, "you dismissed the coded journals and the threats received by his nephew." "Superstition and nonsense," Lestrade replied. "You're chasing shadows." Holmes's expression darkened. "Shadows, Inspector, often hide the most damning truths." That night, Holmes and I returned to the estate to further examine the journals. As we sifted through the documents, a sound from the hallway froze us in place. Before we could react, masked intruders burst into the room. Chaos erupted. They moved with precision, seizing one of the journals before retreating into the night. By the time we gave chase, they had vanished into the fog. "They knew what they were looking for," Holmes observed. "And they found it. But not all of it." He held up another journal, its pages marked with an alchemical symbol. "This, Watson, is what they missed." Back at Baker Street, Holmes pored over the remaining journal. The symbol, a complex interweaving of shapes, seemed to hold the key to the elixir's true purpose. "This symbol," he said, "represents balance, a principle both scientific and philosophical. It is not merely a key to the elixir, but a key to understanding its creator's intent. And what might that intent be? Holmes leaned back, his expression thoughtful. That, my dear Watson, is what we must discover. The house was steeped in a silence that felt almost oppressive. The clock struck midnight, its chime echoing faintly through the empty corridors. I was on the verge of retiring for the night when a faint rustling caught my attention. Moving quietly, I followed the sound, my steps muffled by the thick carpets. There, near the rear door, Miss Tilly fumbled with the lock, a large book clutched tightly to her chest. Her hands trembled as she tried to fit the key. "Miss Tilly," I called out firmly. She froze, the color draining from her face. "Going somewhere?" Her voice wavered as she stammered a response. "I only meant to take some of the doctor's papers for safekeeping. They are valuable, you see." Holmes appeared from the shadows, his gaze cold and unyielding. "And yet, you felt the need to leave under cover of darkness, with no intention of informing anyone." I feared they would be stolen," she protested weakly, though her avoidance of his eyes betrayed her guilt. Holmes stepped closer, his voice as sharp as a blade. "What is it you truly fear, Miss Tilly?" "That someone might discover what lies within that tome." She clutched the book tighter, her silence more telling than any confession. "Watson, take note," Holmes murmured. "This is no act of loyalty, it is one of desperation." The following day, Holmes and I paid a visit to Professor Thaddeus Lyle. His study was a chaotic maze of books and alchemical apparatus, his demeanor as theatrical as his surroundings. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us, his tone dripping with affected charm. "To what do I owe the honor?" "We seek clarity regarding your relationship with Dr. Philip Cartwright," Holmes replied, his voice measured. "Specifically, the nature of your alchemical pursuits." Lyle laughed, a sound that felt more rehearsed than genuine. "Philip and I were rivals in theory but allies in practice. He believed in the mystical, I preferred the empirical. A healthy debate, nothing more. And yet," Holmes pressed, "you were aware of his experiments with the emerald elixir." Lyle's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "A trifling curiosity, I assure you. I had no involvement. And your whereabouts on the night of his death?" "Hosting a lecture at the Royal Society, as many can attest." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Convenient, yet insufficient. Your knowledge of his journals exceeds mere curiosity. Tell me, Professor, what do you truly know of the elixir?" Lyle leaned back, his smile fading entirely. "Enough to know it should never have existed." While Holmes pursued his inquiries, I took it upon myself to speak with the locals. Rumors had a way of weaving truth into their fabric, and I was determined to uncover them. At a modest tavern near the estate, I struck up a conversation with an old coachman. Over a pint, his tongue loosened, and he shared a chilling tale. "They call themselves the Eternal Circle," he muttered, glancing around as if the very mention of the name would summon dark forces. "A society, secret and ancient, obsessed with living forever." "And what of Dr. Cartwright?" I asked. "Some say he was one of them, others that he defied them. Either way, his death ain't an accident. Those folk don't take kindly to betrayal." The weight of his words hung heavily as I returned to Holmes, who listened with a faint smile. "Eternal life," he mused. "A seductive promise, but one that often masks darker intentions." Holmes had spent the evening immersed in his work, the journals spread out before him, their pages filled with symbols and diagrams that seemed impenetrable to me. "Observe, Watson," he said, holding up a page. "This diagram is not merely an experiment, it is a map." "A map?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. "Indeed. A map concealed within layers of cipher and alchemical symbology. It points to a specific location, one tied to the elixir's purpose." He worked methodically, his deductions flowing seamlessly. Each line, each symbol, yielded a new piece of the puzzle. Hours later, he leaned back, a satisfied gleam in his eye. "The apothecary in Whitechapel. That is where our answers lie." Before acting on his discovery, Holmes sought a meeting with Inspector Lestrade. The man was as dismissive as ever. "A burglary gone wrong, Holmes. Nothing more." "Yet you failed to mention the ciphered letters received by his nephew," Holmes countered. "A coincidence," Lestrade replied, his tone firm. Holmes's expression darkened. "Coincidences are the refuge of the unimaginative. You dismissed vital evidence, Inspector." "Why?" Lestrade shifted uncomfortably but offered no response. Holmes's gaze was unrelenting. "The truth, Lestrade, will emerge, whether you assist or not." We left Scotland Yard late that evening, the streets shrouded in fog. The air was thick, damp, and oppressive, yet Holmes moved with purpose. "Do you feel it, Watson?" he asked quietly. "We are not alone." The sound of footsteps echoed faintly behind us, growing louder as we quickened our pace. Turning sharply into an alley, Holmes gestured for silence. The figure that followed was clad in a dark cloak, their face obscured. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the night. "You have been found. Speak, or face the consequences." The figure hesitated before drawing a blade. Holmes moved swiftly, disarming them with calculated precision. Yet before we could interrogate them, they swallowed a vial of poison, collapsing at our feet. The next morning brought new devastation. The estate was ablaze, flames consuming the laboratory and much of its contents. By the time we arrived, little remained but ash and ruin. "It is no accident," Holmes said grimly. "Someone seeks to erase the evidence." Among the wreckage, Holmes found a fragment of a journal, its edges singed but its content intact. His sharp eyes scanned the page, a faint smile forming. "They failed, Watson. This fragment points us to our next destination. The apothecary awaits." Back at Baker Street, Holmes studied the fragment with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The symbols revealed a profound truth. The key, Watson, is not a physical object. It is a concept, a test of morality, encoded within the elixir's very formula. Cartwright sought not to create immortality, but to expose those unworthy of it. The revelation turned the case on its head, its implications far greater than we had imagined. And so, with renewed determination, we prepared for what lay ahead. The fog clung to the narrow streets of Whitechapel like a living thing, muffling every sound and shrouding the world in shadow. The apothecary stood before us, its windows dimly lit, exuding an air of mystery and menace. Holmes crouched behind a stack of crates, his sharp eyes fixed on the door. Lestrade, muttering under his breath about the cold, stood slightly apart, his impatience poorly concealed. "You're certain this is the place?" he asked. "Certainty is the foundation of deduction," Holmes replied softly. "And I have deduced that we are precisely where we ought to be." I observed the building with unease, its broken shutters and grimy facade telling a story of secrets long buried. "And if we're not alone in our interest?" I asked. Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then, Watson, the game becomes all the more interesting." We moved as one, entering the apothecary with cautious steps. The interior was a chaotic labyrinth of shelves laden with vials and jars, their contents obscured by years of grime. In the center of the room stood Professor Lyle, his back to us, his hands clasped behind him. "I wondered when you would arrive," he said without turning, his voice tinged with amusement. Holmes stepped forward, his tone sharp. "Your theatrics do you no favors, Lyle. We are here for answers." Lyle turned, his face a mask of defiance. "Answers? Very well. You seek the truth about the elixir. It is everything your imagination dares to conceive, and more. An elixir of life, capable of defying nature itself." Holmes's skepticism was palpable. "Not merely life, Holmes. Eternity. A gift to those bold enough to seize it. And yet," Holmes countered, "your colleague met his end in pursuit of this so-called gift. What does that say about its efficacy?" Lyle's expression darkened. Philip lacked the courage to see it through. He faltered where I will not. His conviction was unsettling, a man consumed by the very thing he sought to control. "You speak of courage," Holmes said, his voice cold, "but I see only hubris." Holmes advanced, his gaze unyielding. "You claim the elixir holds the secret to immortality, yet you stand here mortal as the rest of us. Why?" Lyle hesitated, the question cutting through his bravado. "Because the elixir is incomplete," he admitted. "It requires the key to unlock its full potential." Holmes studied him intently. "And that key, Lyle, is not what you believe it to be. The journals reveal its true purpose, an ethical test designed to expose the flaws of those who seek it." Lyle's face twisted in anger. "A test? You expect me to believe Philip created this as some moral exercise?" "The elixir was never meant to grant life eternal," Holmes continued. "It is a mirror, reflecting the greed and ambition of those who pursue it. You have been chasing a shadow, Lyle." The weight of Holmes's words settled over the room, leaving Lyle visibly shaken. Before Lyle could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps drew our attention. The door creaked open, admitting a group of figures cloaked in long coats and wide-brimmed hats. Their leader, a tall man with a commanding presence, stepped forward. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "we meet at last." Holmes's expression remained neutral. "And you are?" "The eternal circle requires no introduction," the man replied, his voice cold and measured. We are here for the elixir. The group fanned out, their movements deliberate. And what do you intend to do with it? Holmes asked, his tone icy. Restore balance, the man replied. Control the chaos of mortality. Holmes regarded him with disdain. Control, you say? That word often masks tyranny. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a vial, its green liquid glinting faintly in the dim light. If it is the elixir you seek, then here it is. The leader's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. Why would you hand it over so easily? Because, Holmes said, his tone laced with mockery, I know the folly of desiring it. He extended the vial, and as the leader reached for it, a swift movement from Holmes triggered a concealed mechanism. A burst of smoke filled the room, throwing the society into chaos. I followed Holmes's lead, seizing the opportunity to secure Lyle, who appeared frozen in disbelief. Lestrade, to his credit, managed to apprehend 2 of the society members as the others fled into the night. When the smoke cleared, the leader stood alone, his mask now removed. The leader's face was one I recognized immediately. Lord Eversley, I whispered, astonishment overtaking me. Holmes's voice cut through the shock. The pillar of London society. Tell me, Eversley, how does a man of your stature find himself here? Eversley's calm facade cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. The elixir is more than a dream. It is a necessity. Humanity's survival depends on it. Humanity, Holmes replied, will survive its flaws far better than it would your ambition. The revelation of Eversley's identity sent ripples through the room, each of us grappling with the implications of his fall from grace. Eversley, cornered but unyielding, made one final attempt to regain control. You may expose me, but you will never destroy the eternal circle. We are more than men, we are an idea. Holmes's voice was quiet but firm. And ideas, Eversley, are only as strong as the men who embody them. Your greed has undone you. The confrontation escalated as Eversley made a desperate escape bid, but Holmes's foresight had left him no avenue. Trapped, he could do little but surrender to his fate. The eternal circle was dismantled, its leaders apprehended, and the elixir's true nature revealed. Holmes, ever the enigma, seemed unmoved by the victory. Justice is often a matter of perspective, he said as we walked back through the foggy streets. But today, we have ensured that ambition unchecked does not prevail. I could not help but marvel at his brilliance, though I sensed a lingering melancholy in his tone, a recognition, perhaps, of the humanity within those he had defeated. The apothecary was eerily silent as Professor Lyle, flanked by 2 constables, was escorted into the waiting carriage. His face betrayed neither guilt nor regret, only a cold detachment that unsettled those who watched. You've played your part well, Holmes, Lyle said, his voice measured. But tell me, do you truly believe this ends here? Holmes's expression remained impassive. I believe, Lyle, that you have underestimated the cost of your ambitions. You call it ambition, I call it vision, Lyle retorted. The elixir represents more than you or I. It is the future. And yet, Holmes countered, it has left you nothing but ruin. As the carriage door closed, I could not help but feel a pang of pity. Lyle, for all his brilliance, had become consumed by his desires, unable to distinguish between progress and peril. Holmes, however, stood unmoved, his gaze fixed on the departing figure. Is there no redemption for a man like him? I asked. Redemption, Holmes replied, is a choice, Watson, and Lyle has long since chosen otherwise. The unmasking of Lord Eversley as the leader of the Eternal Circle sent ripples through London's elite. Newspapers ran bold headlines, exposing the aristocrats' involvement in a shadowy cabal that sought to manipulate power under the guise of pursuing immortality. I read the accounts with a mixture of astonishment and dismay. The city is in uproar, I remarked. Eversley was regarded as a paragon of virtue. Holmes shrugged, the faintest hint of cynicism in his voice. Virtue is often a mask, Watson. The higher a man's standing, the greater his fall when the mask slips. Do you think this will change anything? I asked. Perhaps, Holmes said thoughtfully. But corruption thrives in the shadows, and London has no shortage of those. It was a sobering thought, one that left me questioning how much of the world we truly understood, even in victory. The vial rested on the table between us, its green liquid shimmering faintly in the lamplight. Mr. Cartwright sat across from us, his expression heavy with indecision. What if it's true? He asked. What if it really does hold the secret to eternal life? Holmes leaned forward, his gaze piercing. And what would you do with such a secret, Mr. Cartwright? Use it, Sell it. Guard it. No man is incorruptible in the face of such temptation. Cartwright hesitated, his hands trembling as he picked up the vial. My uncle believed in its power. Your uncle, Holmes said quietly, was consumed by it. Do not let his fate become yours. With a deep breath, Cartwright rose and moved to the fireplace. He hesitated for only a moment before casting the vial into the flames. The liquid hissed and bubbled, releasing a faint, acrid smoke before disappearing entirely. It is done, Cartwright murmured. And wisely so, Holmes replied. Back at Baker Street, the familiar comforts of our sitting room felt all the more welcome after the intensity of the case. Holmes settled into his chair, his violin resting against his knee, while I poured myself a brandy. It is remarkable how easily men are swayed by the promise of power, I said, breaking the silence. Holmes looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. Power, Watson, is the most intoxicating of pursuits. It blinds even the most rational minds. And yet, you remain immune, I replied. Holmes chuckled softly. Immune? Hardly. But I have the benefit of seeing it for what it is, a fleeting illusion. The conversation turned to the case itself, and I marveled at the layers Holmes had unraveled. You see the world in ways I can scarcely comprehend, I admitted. Perhaps, Holmes said, his tone reflective. But the world, Watson, is as much a mystery to me as it is to anyone. That is why I chase its secrets. As the evening wore on, I noticed an uncharacteristic quiet in Holmes's demeanor. His gaze lingered on the fire, his usual sharpness tempered by something softer. Does the case trouble you still? I asked. Not the case, he replied, his voice low. But the men involved. Lyle, Eversley, even Cartwright. They are all reflections of what we could become, given the right, or wrong, circumstances. I was taken aback by his candor. You speak as though you see yourself in them. Do you think me impervious to ambition? Holmes asked, his eyes meeting mine. The pursuit of knowledge, of answers, it is a form of greed, Watson. The difference is what one does with it. For a moment, the great detective seemed not a figure of logic and intellect, but a man, fallible and introspective. It was a rare and humbling sight. You use your gifts for good, I said firmly. Perhaps, Holmes replied, though his tone carried the weight of doubt. But one must always question where the line lies. The room fell silent once more, the crackle of the fire our only companion. It was a fitting end to a case that had revealed not only the depths of human ambition, but also the fragile balance between virtue and vice. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the familiar sitting room. The case was closed, and yet, as I sat in my armchair, a glass of brandy in hand, my mind wrestled with questions that refused to rest. The emerald elixir, its true purpose revealed, had been destroyed. But the motives of Dr. Philip Cartwright remained an enigma. Was he a man driven by noble intent, crafting a test to expose greed? Or was there a darker truth, a secret he intended to take to his grave? I cannot help but wonder, I began, breaking the silence. Was the elixir merely a test of morality, or was there something more? Something we may never fully understand. Holmes reclined in his chair, appeared lost in thought. The soft glow of the fire highlighted the sharp angles of his face, his features as inscrutable as ever. For all his brilliance, even he had left parts of this case unanswered, a rare occurrence that left me unsettled. The unanswered threads dangled before me, tantalizing and maddening in equal measure. Perhaps, I thought, some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Holmes turned his head slightly, the faintest smile playing on his lips. Ah, Watson, he murmured, the beauty of a mystery lies not in its resolution, but in its capacity to provoke thought. He said no more, his expression betraying nothing. Whether his smile was one of satisfaction, amusement, or something else entirely, I could not tell. In that moment, I realized that Holmes, in his own way, delighted in the uncertainties of life as much as he sought to untangle them. The true nature of the elixir, it seemed, would remain shrouded in ambiguity. The quiet was interrupted by a firm knock at the door. It was late, too late for casual callers, and the sound carried an urgency that set my nerves on edge. Holmes sat upright, his sharp eyes glinting with anticipation. A visitor, at this hour? Curious. I moved to answer, the creak of the floorboards and the rattle of the door handle punctuating the silence. A man stood there, his coat damp from the fog, his expression one of desperation. I must speak with Mr. Holmes, he said, his voice trembling. It is a matter of utmost urgency. I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Holmes, already on his feet, extended a hand toward the man. "You have found the right address. Speak, sir, and be assured that you will have my undivided attention." The visitor hesitated, as though gathering his thoughts, before beginning his tale. Holmes turned to me, his eyes alight with excitement. "Watson, fetch your coat. The night promises intrigue, and the game is, once again, afoot." With those words, the familiar thrill of a new mystery swept over me, and I followed him into the unknown, eager for what lay ahead.